Look at this one. Probably some think tank intern waiting for her congressman to finish his steak. Ma'am, this table is reserved for people who actually serve, not serve drinks. Time to move. The crowd of young men in crisp civilian clothes, all with the same hard-edged, athletic bearing, laughed. The laughter was sharp and dismissive, echoing off the dark wood and polished brass of the exclusive club near the Coronado shore, a place that prided itself on being a sanctuary for the warrior class. The woman at the table did not look up from her tablet. Her focus remained on the lines of text, her posture a study in serene stillness. She wore a simple charcoal silk blouse and dark, tailored slacks, an outfit of understated elegance that seemed to make her blend into the shadows of the booth. Her hair, a mix of silver and dark brown, was tied back in a neat, functional bun. There was nothing about her that screamed authority, nothing that demanded attention. She was the picture of quiet anonymity, a ghost in a room full of roaring lions. But when a towering Navy SEAL, a petty officer first class named Trent Rhino Davies, placed his thick, calloused hand on her shoulder to physically guide her away, there was a subtle shift in the air. It was a change so imperceptible that only someone trained to notice such things would catch it. The general, sitting in a darkened corner with the base commander, saw it. He saw the way her shoulders, though relaxed, didn't yield a single millimeter to the pressure. He saw the way her eyes, when she finally lifted them from the screen, were not angry or scared or indignant. They were calm. They were analytical. They were the eyes of a predator assessing a threat, not with fear, but with a profound and unsettling patience. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, type silence below. The silence that followed her gaze was more powerful than any shouted retort could ever be. It stretched, thin and taut, a wire of tension in the boisterous room. Rhino, accustomed to immediate deference or fiery confrontation, was momentarily thrown off balance by this utter lack of reaction. His hand remained on her shoulder, an anchor of arrogance in a sea of sudden uncertainty. He mistook her calm for weakness, her silence for submission. It was a common mistake, one made by men who measured strength in decibels and dominance in physical presence. "Hello, did you hear me?" he pressed, his voice louder now, drawing more attention. "This is our spot. We just got back from a rotation. I think we've earned the right to a decent view of the bay, don't you boys?" His teammates chorused their agreement, their confidence bolstered by his. They were a pack, young and strong, and this woman was an intruder, an outsider who didn't understand the rules of their world. She finally spoke, her voice so low it was almost a whisper, yet it cut through the noise with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "I'm quite comfortable where I am, petty officer." She didn't look at his hand, but he felt the weight of her words on it, and he instinctively, if briefly, loosened his grip. The use of his rank, spoken with such casual, unbothered authority, was a minor anomaly, a flicker on a radar screen that he chose to ignore. He saw a middle-aged woman, alone, in a place she clearly didn't belong. His assumptions were a fortress, and he was not about to surrender it. He leaned in closer, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look, I don't want to have to call management. This is a private club. For military. You clearly took a wrong turn somewhere between the yacht club and the spa. So why don't you be a good girl and find a stool at the bar? I'll even buy you an aplatini for your trouble." The insult was deliberate, a final, public humiliation designed to force her from the seat. The laughter from his friends was louder this time, more cruel. The entire west side of the club was now watching the drama unfold. Junior officers averted their eyes, not wanting to get involved. A few enlisted sailors looked uncomfortable, but none dared to intervene. Rhino and his team were SEALs, the modern-day deities of the naval base, and their arrogance was often mistaken for divine right. The woman simply blinked. She didn't recoil. She didn't blush with shame. She picked up her water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and placed it back on the coaster with a soft, definitive click. Her every movement was economical, devoid of wasted energy. It was a discipline of motion that was utterly at odds with the civilian persona he had assigned to her. Her silence was a mirror, and in it, his own boorish behavior was reflected back at him, magnified and ugly. He was beginning to feel a prickle of irritation, the kind that comes when a simple act of dominance meets an inexplicable, immovable object. He was about to escalate, to raise his voice and make a scene that would be impossible to ignore, when the world outside the plate glass window, the serene, star-dusted view of the San Diego Bay, erupted in a silent, violent flash of red and blue light. The world was about to change, and with it, every single one of Trent Davies' foolish assumptions. The true test was not of strength, but of composure, and the woman he was trying to bully was about to give a masterclass. The sudden chaos was immediate and absolute. The club's ambient music cut out, replaced by the shrill, piercing tone of a base-wide security alert blaring from speakers mounted on the walls. Red emergency lights began to strobe, bathing the panicked faces of the patrons in a hellish, pulsating glow. The club's private security, two burly men in ill-fitting blazers, moved towards the doors, their expressions a mixture of confusion and fear. Cell phones lit up across the room as people tried to get information, but the signal was dead. A jamming protocol. That simple fact sent a wave of genuine dread through the military personnel in the room. This wasn't a drill. This was real. The senior officer on site, a young Navy lieutenant named Harris, fresh from a desk job at NavBase Coronado headquarters, began shouting into his radio, his voice cracking with inexperience. "This is Oasis Club. We are in lockdown. What is the nature of the threat? Over." The response was a burst of static, followed by fragmented, panicked chatter from different channels. "Motorcade compromised. VIP is off-grid, possible hostile element." I repeat, the information was disjointed, a recipe for disaster. Rhino and his SEAL team, their earlier arrogance forgotten, immediately shifted into operator mode. They began moving through the crowd, their voices sharp and commanding, trying to establish control. "Everyone away from the windows. Get down. Hands where I can see them." They were warriors, trained for direct action, for violence and speed. But this situation wasn't about kicking down a door. It was about command and control, about processing information and making decisions under immense pressure. They were creating more noise, more confusion, their tactical instincts at odds with the strategic necessity of the moment. Amidst this rising tide of panic, the woman in the charcoal silk blouse moved with an almost supernatural calm. She had placed her tablet carefully back in her leather satchel and stood up. Her movements were not rushed. They were fluid, efficient, and imbued with a sense of purpose that stood in stark contrast to the frantic energy surrounding her. Her eyes, those calm, analytical eyes, were not wide with fear. They were scanning. She was taking in the entire scene, processing it not as a victim, but as a commander on a battlefield. She noted the positions of the security guards, the number of exits, the panic state of Lieutenant Harris, the aggressive but directionless actions of the SEALs. She was assessing her assets and liabilities, formulating a plan with the speed of a supercomputer. Her face was a mask of placid concentration, a small island of order in an ocean of chaos. She was not preparing to fight. She was preparing to lead. She was about to demonstrate a skill far more rare and far more powerful than the brute force personified by the man who had just tried to eject her from her seat. Her competence was a coiled spring, held in check by a lifetime of discipline, and it was about to be released with devastating and undeniable force. The room was a tinderbox of fear, and she was the only one holding the water. She walked directly towards the epicenter of the chaos, her path cutting a straight line through the cowering patrons. Lieutenant Harris was now pale, sweat beading on his forehead as he fumbled with his radio, trying to get a clear directive from a command structure that was clearly in disarray itself. Rhino and his men were arguing with the club security, trying to assert their authority without any official standing. The entire situation was seconds from collapsing into complete, unmanageable panic. The woman reached the flustered lieutenant and did not tap his shoulder or shout for his attention. She simply stood in his peripheral vision, a pillar of stillness, until he finally noticed her. He glanced at her, his eyes full of dismissal for another hysterical civilian, and was about to wave her away when she spoke. Her voice was unchanged, still quiet, yet possessed a resonant frequency of command that vibrated in the very air. "Lieutenant," she said, the single word cutting through his panic like a laser. He stopped shouting into his radio and stared at her. "Initiate protocol Sierra Whiskey. I am assuming tactical command. Designate me Olympus." The phrase was a thunderclap in the silent space of his mind. Protocol Sierra Whiskey was a continuity of command directive, so obscure and high-level that he had only ever read about it in a single briefing during his officer training at Annapolis. It was a protocol that could only be invoked by a flag officer in person during a catastrophic breakdown of the local chain of command. It was a phrase that carried the weight of the entire United States Navy. The lieutenant's mind reeled, trying to reconcile the words he had just heard with the unassuming woman standing before him. But there was something in her eyes, an iron certainty, an absolute authority that short-circuited his doubt. His training, deeply ingrained, took over. His back straightened. His panic vanished, replaced by the reflexive obedience of a junior officer in the presence of a superior. "Yes, ma'am," he stammered, his voice suddenly clear. The woman, now Olympus, turned her attention to the room. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice projected with a calm, unshakable force. "Petty officer," she said, her eyes finding Rhino across the room. He froze mid-argument, stunned by the sound of his own rank being called by this woman. "You and your team, secure all points of entry. No one in or out. Use club security to assist. Establish a fatal funnel at the main entrance. I want to report on your status in 90 seconds. Her orders were precise, tactically flawless, and delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. The SEALs men trained to recognize and respond to competent leadership above all else reacted instinctively. The confusion vanished from their faces, replaced by the focused intensity of the operator. Without a word, without a moment's hesitation, Rhino nodded sharply. "Yes, ma'am." He and his team moved with a sudden, lethal grace, their chaotic energy now channeled into a singular, directed purpose. The woman then turned back to the lieutenant. "Get me a secure channel to Nav-Base Command. Now, tell them Olympus is on station and requires an immediate sit-rep on the Viceroy package Viceroy." Another high-level code name, this one for a visiting member of the Joint Chiefs. In the space of 30 seconds, she had taken complete and total control of the crisis. She had diagnosed the problem, identified her assets, and issued a series of perfect, interlocking commands that transformed a panic mob into a functioning tactical unit. The immediate aftermath was a deafening quiet. The screaming had stopped. The running had ceased. The only sounds were the disciplined movements of the SEALs and the now steady voice of Lieutenant Harris on the radio. Everyone else in the room was simply staring, their mouths agape, at the woman in the silk blouse who now stood at the center of the storm, directing it as if she were born to it. Rhino, after positioning his men at the door, looked back at her, his face a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock. This was not possible. This was not a congressman's wife. This was not a lost tourist. This was a commander. And as he watched her calmly coordinate the defense of the entire facility, a cold, terrifying thought began to dawn in his mind. He had not just insulted a civilian. He had committed an act of professional suicide of catastrophic proportions. The lockdown held for another 20 minutes, an eternity of tense, disciplined silence orchestrated by the woman known only as Olympus. She had turned a corner of the main bar into a makeshift command post, using the terrified but now compliant Lieutenant Harris as her communications link. She coordinated with the base's rapid response teams, guided them to establish a secondary perimeter, and received real-time intelligence on the status of the compromised motorcade. Her questions were sharp, her insights profound, her strategic grasp of the evolving situation nothing short of brilliant. She saw angles no one else saw, anticipated problems before they arose. She was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. Rhino and his team, humbled into silent efficiency, held their positions with unwavering professionalism. He watched her, unable to look away, replaying his earlier actions in his mind with a mounting sense of horror. Every arrogant word, every dismissive gesture, now seemed like an act of profound sacrilege. Who was she? The question burned in his mind, a firestorm of confusion and dread. The answer arrived in the form of screeching tires and the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots on pavement. The main doors, which his team had been guarding, were thrown open. A full Marine Fleet Anti-Terrorism Security Team, or FAST platoon, flooded into the club, their M4 rifles at the ready, sweeping every corner with practiced, lethal precision. They were followed by a man whose presence immediately commanded the attention of every service member in the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair cropped close to his scalp and the twin stars of a Rear Admiral gleaming on the collar of his uniform. This was Rear Admiral Wallace, the commander of Naval Base Coronado, and his face was a mask of grim determination. He strode into the center of the room, his eyes scanning the scene, taking in the controlled quiet, the secure positions of the SEALs, the focused demeanor of Lieutenant Harris. His gaze finally landed on the woman at the bar, who was just now turning to face him. The Admiral's expression of hardened resolve instantly melted away, replaced by something else entirely, a look of profound, almost reverent recognition. He didn't hesitate. He marched directly past the FAST team, past the stunned SEALs, and came to a halt 3 feet in front of her. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight, and executed the sharpest, most formal salute of his long and decorated career. The gesture was so crisp, so full of respect, that it seemed to suck the very air from the room. "Admiral Morgan, Mom." Wallace's voice boomed with a mixture of relief and deference. "I apologize for the delay in our response. We had a complete communications blackout on our end. Your actions here were textbook. You have the Viceroy." The room went utterly still. The words "Admiral Morgan" and "Ma'am" hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Rhino felt the blood drain from his face. It was as if the ground had fallen away beneath his feet. Admiral, not a captain, not a commander, an admiral. The rank was almost mythical, a pantheon of gods who steered the course of the entire Navy. He had never even been in the same room as a 4-star admiral before, let alone spoken to one, let alone put his hands on one. The woman, Admiral Morgan, simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "The situation is secure, Admiral Wallace. The Viceroy is not on site. It was a false alarm, a diversion. The real target was a data transfer at the Naval Communications Station. I believe you'll find they've already dealt with it." Her assessment was delivered with the same quiet calm, the same lack of ego. She had seen through the entire feint, a complex piece of enemy misdirection that had fooled the entire base command. Rear Admiral Wallace simply nodded, his respect for her deepening with every word she spoke. The legend was true. Rear Admiral Wallace turned his gaze from Admiral Morgan, and it swept across the room, finally landing, like a pair of targeting lasers, on Petty Officer Trent Rhino Davies. The warmth and respect in the Admiral's eyes vanished, replaced by a glacial fury that was terrifying to behold. Wallace was a man known for his calm demeanor, but what Rhino saw in his eyes now was the promise of a storm, a hurricane of institutional wrath about to be unleashed directly upon his head. The Rear Admiral took a slow, deliberate step towards him. The FAST Team Marines, sensing the shift in tone, remained at their posts, but their attention was now fixed on the unfolding drama. Lieutenant Harris looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "Petty Officer Davies," Wallace began, his voice dangerously quiet, a low rumble that promised thunder. Rhino's body, trained through years of brutal discipline, snapped to an instinctive position of attention, his hands cupped at his sides, his eyes locked forward. "Yes, Admiral," he managed to say, his own voice sounding distant and thin. Wallace stopped directly in front of him, close enough for Rhino to see the faint scar above his right eye. "I received a preliminary report from Lieutenant Harris on my way over here," Wallace continued, his voice still low, but each word a hammer blow. He tells me that before this incident began, you took it upon yourself to address a civilian in this establishment. Is that correct? Rhino's throat was dry. Yes, Admiral, and he tells me, Wallace went on, his eyes narrowing, that you chose to place your hands on this civilian. That you attempted to physically remove her from her table because you and your team felt you were more entitled to it. Is that report accurate, petty officer? The shame was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating wave that washed over him. In the rigid world of military honor, there were few things worse than being publicly dressed down by a flag officer. He had brought this upon himself, and the weight of his stupidity was crushing him. Yes, Admiral, that report is accurate. Wallace let the admission hang in the silent room for a long moment. Then, he turned slightly, gesturing with an open hand towards the woman who stood calmly by the bar, watching the exchange without a word. Then allow me to provide you with a piece of intelligence that you so clearly lack, Wallace said, his voice finally rising, crackling with cold, controlled anger. You are not in the presence of a civilian. You are not in the presence of a staffer or a spouse. You are in the presence of Admiral Elena Morgan, Commander, United States Pacific Fleet. He paused, letting the title sink in, letting the full weight of it settle on every person in the room. Then he continued, his voice now a litany of her accomplishments, a verbal recitation of a living legend's service record. The first woman to command a carrier strike group in combat. The architect of Operation Silent Trident, a campaign that will be studied at the War College for the next 100 years. An aviator with over 4,000 carrier landing hours, most of them at night. The woman who signs the deployment orders for every ship, every submarine, and every aircraft in this half of the world. The woman who is, at this very moment, your ultimate commanding officer and the highest-ranking female officer in the history of the United States Armed Forces. Wallace turned his head back to face Rhino, his eyes blazing. You didn't ask a civilian to move. You put your hands on the Pacific Fleet. You insulted a living legend. And you did it because you made an assumption based on what you saw, instead of having the humility to consider what you did not know. You looked at quiet competence and saw only a target for your arrogance. That is a mistake a petty officer cannot afford to make. That is a mistake a Navy SEAL must never make. Am I clear? The final two words were like a physical blow. Rhino could only stammer a single, choked response, the only words left to him in the ruins of his career and his pride. Crystal, Admiral, the story of what happened at the Oasis Club that night did not just spread, it detonated. It moved through Naval Base Coronado with the speed of a shockwave, traveling through whispered conversations in mess halls, encrypted messages between ships at sea, and late-night calls in barracks rooms. It became an instant legend, a piece of modern military folklore. They called it the Night of Olympus, or simply, Morgan's Law. The details were embellished with each telling. The number of hostiles, the level of danger, the ferocity of Admiral Wallace's takedown of the cocky SEAL, but the core of the story, the essential truth of it, remained unchanged. It was a story about assumptions. It was a story about the vast, silent difference between perceived strength and actual power. It became a cautionary tale told to new recruits, a lesson in humility hammered home to cocky junior officers. The name Elena Morgan, already respected in the high echelons of command, became something more among the enlisted ranks, a symbol. She was the quiet professional, the living embodiment of the idea that competence was its own credential, that authority was earned through action, not announced with bravado. The table where she had been sitting, a simple booth overlooking the bay, became an unofficial landmark. It was dubbed the Admiral's Perch. No one ever reserved it. It was simply left open, a silent tribute. Younger officers and enlisted personnel would sometimes sit there, not with the arrogance that Rhino had displayed, but with a kind of quiet reverence, as if hoping some of her composure, her profound and unshakable calm, might somehow rub off on them. The phrase she had used, "Designate me Olympus," entered the unofficial lexicon of the fleet. It became shorthand for taking absolute, decisive, and competent control of a chaotic situation. A Master Chief wrestling with a complex engine casualty might say, "All right, stand back. I'm declaring Olympus a pilot, faced with a sudden in-flight emergency." Might calmly key his mic and say, "Tower, be advised, Olympus is on deck," signaling to his crew that he was taking ultimate control. It was a legacy born not from a battle, but from a moment of pure, unadulterated competence in the face of ignorant prejudice. It was a testament to the fact that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is a calm mind and the will to use it. The ripples of that night spread far beyond the shores of San Diego, a quiet wave of cultural change washing through the ranks of a service that was slowly but surely learning that strength came in many forms, and the most formidable was often the one you never saw coming. For Petty Officer Trent Rhino Davies, the aftermath was a crucible of shame and reflection. He expected to be crucified, a formal captain's mast, a reduction in rank, perhaps even removal from the SEAL teams he had sacrificed so much to join. The weight of his transgression was heavy enough to end a career, and he knew it. He spent the next 48 hours in a state of administrative limbo, confined to his barracks, waiting for the axe to fall. The call finally came, not from his own command, but from the office of the base commander. He was to report, in his dress uniform, to Rear Admiral Wallace's office. He walked the long, sterile corridors of the headquarters building feeling like a man on his way to his own execution. He was ushered into the office, where Wallace sat behind a large mahogany desk, his expression unreadable. But Wallace was not alone. Standing by the window, looking out at the fleet anchored in the harbor, was Admiral Elena Morgan. She was in her own service dress whites now, the 4 silver stars on her shoulder boards seeming to shine with an impossible brightness. She turned as he entered, and her eyes held the same calm, analytical gaze as they had in the club. There was no anger in them, no hint of triumph. There was only a quiet, professional assessment. Rhino stood at rigid attention, his heart pounding in his chest. It was Admiral Morgan who spoke first. At ease, Petty Officer. Her voice was soft, but it carried the effortless authority of her rank. "Admiral Wallace, and I have discussed your actions," she said, her tone matter of fact. "Your record, up until that night, has been exemplary. You are a highly skilled operator, an asset to your team and to the Navy." She paused, letting the words hang in the air before continuing. "You also demonstrated a profound lack of judgment. You allowed arrogance and prejudice to cloud your perception. In a combat situation, that kind of error can cost lives. Your own, and those of the men who trust you to make the right call." She walked slowly towards him, stopping a few feet away. "The Navy has 2 options here. We can punish you, make an example of you, and in doing so, we would likely lose a valuable asset that has cost millions of dollars and years to train. Or we can ensure that the lesson has been learned, truly learned, and that you can then pass that lesson on to others." She looked him directly in the eye. "I have recommended to Admiral Wallace that no formal disciplinary action be taken against you. Your record will remain clean." Rhino was stunned into silence. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was a reprieve he did not deserve, an act of grace that was more humbling than any punishment could ever be. "Mom, I don't understand," he stammered. "You understand perfectly, Petty Officer," she replied, her expression unchanging. "Punishment is easy. Education is hard. Your public humiliation was a far more effective lesson than any reduction in rank. You will carry that with you for the rest of your career. Every time you're about to make a snap judgment, every time you feel the urge to assert your dominance through arrogance, you will remember that night. You will remember what it felt like to be so profoundly and completely wrong. That memory will make you a better SEAL. It will make you a better leader. Do not waste it." She then gave him a single, final piece of advice, words that would become the new cornerstone of his professional ethos. "Competence doesn't need a billboard, Petty Officer. Just be ready." With a slight nod, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving him alone with Admiral Wallace and the echoing silence of his second chance. Months later, the heat of the Persian Gulf shimmered off the deck of the USS Ronald Reagan. Petty Officer Trent Davies stood on the fantail, watching a new group of sailors go through a damage control drill. He was different now. The loud, boisterous energy was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity, a watchfulness that had not been there before. He was more observant, more thoughtful. He spoke less and listened more. His teammates had noticed the change. They called him the monk. Now, a joke that held a core of truth. He had become a student of silence, a believer in the power of quiet competence. A young SEAL, fresh from BUD/S and bristling with the same cocksure arrogance Rhino himself had once possessed, sidled up next to him. The kid gestured with his chin toward a new intelligence officer who was briefing a group of pilots nearby. She was young, barely out of college, and she spoke with a quiet, academic precision. "Look at that," the young SEAL sneered. "They're sending us librarians now." But she's never even seen the inside of a gym. Rhino didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Let me tell you a story," he said. "It's about a table at a club in Coronado. It's about a woman in a silk blouse. And it's about the biggest mistake I ever made in my life." He proceeded to tell the young SEAL the story of the night of Olympus, not as a piece of fleet gossip, but as a personal confession, a parable of his own foolishness. He explained the profound lesson Admiral Morgan had taught him without ever raising her voice, that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one you overlook. That true authority is not projected, it is recognized. The young SEAL listened, his smirk slowly fading, replaced by a look of dawning comprehension and respect. The lesson was being passed on. The legacy was continuing. That was the true genius of Admiral Morgan's leadership. She hadn't just corrected a single sailor's mistake. She had planted a seed of wisdom that was now growing in the harsh, unforgiving soil of special operations culture. The story was now officially part of the curriculum at the Naval Academy. It was used as a case study in leadership ethics, a mandatory part of the character and officership program. At BUD/S, instructors used it to break down the arrogance of new candidates, a real-world example of how assumptions based on gender or appearance could lead to catastrophic failure. The tale of the quiet admiral had become institutional folklore, a living piece of the Navy's honor code, a reminder that the uniform did not define the warrior defined the uniform. True legacy is not carved in stone or cast in bronze. It is not a name on a building or a title on a plaque. It is a lesson that is lived, a principle that is passed from one generation to the next, a quiet ripple of change that spreads through the silent depths of an institution. Admiral Elena Morgan's legacy was not in the battle she had won or the command she had held. It was in the change she had inspired in a single, arrogant petty officer. It was in the story he now told to a new generation of warriors, ensuring that her lesson in humility and respect would echo long after she had retired her commission. Her victory that night was not over a security threat or a panicked room. It was a victory over prejudice, a triumph over the easy, lazy poison of assumption. She proved, in one quiet, decisive moment, that competence is its own authority. She demonstrated that respect is not something you can demand with a loud voice or a heavy hand. It is something you command with your actions, with your discipline, with the silent, undeniable power of your professionalism. Her silence in the face of insult was not weakness. It was the calm before the storm of her capability. Her minimal words were not a sign of meekness. They were the precise and economical tools of a master. She taught the United States Navy a lesson it desperately needed to learn, that its greatest strength lay not only in its ships and its weapons, but in the character of its people. And that character is best measured not in times of celebrated victory, but in quiet moments of personal integrity. The true strength of a warrior is not the ability to fight, but the wisdom to know when and how to lead. It is the understanding that true power needs no announcement, for it is felt in the calm of a crisis, it is heard in the clarity of command, and it is seen in the eyes of those who witness it. It is the quiet professional who ultimately shapes the world, not with noise, but with effect. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent professionalism defines true worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.